Welcome to On the Horn with Charley Armey. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. This is a show that airs regularly on Open Range. I use it as a time to look in depth at certain people that have very distinguished careers and interesting backgrounds. I've initially started this out by having On the Horn with Charley's brother, Dick Armey, and we're going to try to have both of them together on a show together, growing up together. So Charley, welcome to Open Range and On the Horn, and just talking through a little bit. This is our last segment. We've had 5 hours together. This is hour number 6 that we've shared on this show. And I'm excited to have you back, but I'm also feeling a little lost that we're coming to an end with some of this.
It has been a lot of fun and a lot of taking me back to a lot of memories that I cherish and all the years I spent in the National Football League. And there's a lot of incidents and things that happen when you're in the National Football League that stay with you forever. Players' names and what they have achieved and what you feel that the success has been. And you've been part of it. And even if it's a small part, you're still part of it. And that has been very rewarding. One thing I'd like to point out, I didn't make mention in the last show we had, we were talking about Dick Vermeil. One of the things that made Dick Vermeil great, all the years I've known Dick Vermeil, I've never once heard him use the word I. Every time he talked about any situation, any success or whatever we had, he always used the word we. I've never heard him use the word. I never heard him. I asked him one time, I said, what about, how come you don't take credit? He says, you don't take credit, you earn credit. And then that was a fascinating thing about him. Another thing about Dick Vermeil that's amazing, how he always included everybody in everything that he ever did. And he was quick to make sure that everybody got their rewards or their feelings about how they contributed to his success. He was a great guy to work for. What a wonderful human being.
Charley, I got a question for you that I'm perplexed about, and I've really been wanting to ask somebody, and it just came to me now. We have all these young coaches in the NFL, whether we're at San Francisco or we're talking about the Rams, the coach for the Vikings. Where did these guys come from? I thought so often you had to start at high school, work your way through a college coach, and maybe you get to the NFL, or maybe you're a player. Where and how did these young coaches all of a sudden catapult themselves to the top of the sport that's the biggest sport in America, the NFL? How did that happen?
The word is mentor. If you take the coach for San Francisco, for example, his success can be traced right back to his father. He's a typical piece of the old quote that it doesn't fall far from the tree. And the coach at the Rams, his grandfather was one of the great minds in football. So usually when these young guys that come in with success, you could trace it back to how they've been developed by either their fathers or their mentor or a previous coach that they worked under. And usually they have adopted that kind of a philosophy and that kind of a work ethic that contributes to their success. But you can always trace it back, and you can find there's a common denominator there at some point. And very few just come out of nowhere and develop and become a great head football coach. Well, I went through a lot of the aspects that make a great football coach. And these young men, they seem to have that. They seem to have developed it either from their parents or their father or their mentor, their coach that they worked under. So it's not an easy task to develop that kind of skill, but it has happened, and it happens more often than you would think. And when a young coach is successful, look at his family tree or look at who he worked under at some point.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about, as long as I'm asking, and we're talking about coaches, give me a perspective on player coaches, people that played in the NFL, and all of a sudden now they become a quarterback coach, an offensive coordinator, and a head coach or defense. You see a lot of that. I get that. That makes sense to me, but because there are just some people that have the right mind. But you talk about mentor, I mean, it's leadership. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I'll give you a great example. At the New England Patriots today, their head coach, who did he play under when he had his great success? Bill Belichick. Who does he pattern himself after? Bill Belichick. He coaches the same way with the same mental discipline that Bill Belichick coached him with and what he played with. So again, it goes back at some point in their development, they've latched onto or become attached to somebody who they believed in and adapted their personality on the football field. And if you there's not much difference between the way he coaches today at the Patriots and the way Belichick coached at the Patriots. And the players who have played for the Patriots will tell you the same thing. When he was a player, he was the typical type of player that you would want under Bill Belichick, and then he adapted that personality and that coaching method. And then he's been very successful, and he'll continue to be successful as long as he maintains that status.
So, Charlie, you're a candid guy. You say what's on your mind. I read an article this morning. I read my news. I get up around between 4 and 5:30 pretty much every morning. And so that's when I read my news, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, I look through Apple News, and I do all my stuff online. But I read an article today about Bill Belichick and his 25-year-old girlfriend. Give me your reaction to that. I don't get this.
That mystifies me. I never saw that in his personality. Of course, you never know. Love comes in strange places. But when I was with Bill Belichick, he was in a very stable marriage relationship. And I never, ever even had any hint that there might be some fractures in his personality that way. But it's hard for anybody to say. It's hard to say what happened. I've seen a lot of great relationships where the age difference. My grandfather was 17 years older than my grandmother, and they lived their entire lives together and had 8 children. So it's not uncommon to have an age split, but this is a little bit mystifying to me. But I don't judge something like this because I don't know the circumstances. I don't know how it came about. And maybe he really loves her and she really loves him. And really, in the end, that's all that matters.
I appreciate that insight into that because because to me, it's quirky because Belichick has his post-game interview and he just, yeah, no, maybe, yeah, we'll have to work on that, yeah. And it's just hilarious watching him. But I also take into account the stress of an athlete and coaches and marriages. Now, you were married for a long time. When I first had you on, you said your wife passed away a few years ago. Talk a little bit about it, but the strain being in the NFL and having the responsibilities, whether you're a coach or you're a scout, general manager, player, that is really a difficult thing for a marriage actually to hang together, isn't it?
It really is. Audrey and I were married for 60 years, and we met in college, and then we got married while we were still both in college. And I was a veteran, and I was 24, she was 21, and we lived our entire lives together. And it's not easy, but one of the things that made our marriage successful is we were both very good at looking at any incident or problem that happened while we were married from our spouse's perspective. In other words, if there was something come up as an argument, I had very few arguments with my wife, and the ones I did have, I lost. But I always looked at anything from her perspective because I realized there's a lot of stress and strain on a wife in the National Football League, either as a coach's wife or a player's wife or a scout's wife, because of the time that you have to spend with your football team and in your profession to make it successful. So there's a lot of times when the wife is not only the wife, but she's the cook, she's the janitor, she's the bus driver, she does everything that has to be done by both parties to keep the life and marriage successful and keep the kids and everybody on the straight and narrow. And it's not an easy task. I think my brother said at one time, the most underpaid people in the world are housewives. They're the ones that do the hardest work, and they're the most underpaid. It's a tough thing to do, but I never had a day when I was ever gone from home when I didn't talk to my wife and my daughters on the telephone, not one single day. I always made it a point to always talk to them. And the other two things that made it easy, they knew they could always get a hold of me. They knew where I was all the time. And I don't drink. I never have been a drinker. And so they always knew that I would be in my room working on whatever project I was working on. If I was out traveling and scouting, I'd be working on grading players. But they always knew they could pick up the telephone and I was there whenever they needed me. And you have to be conscious of what the wife has to go through to make the marriage successful. And my wife was prayed. I was very lucky to have such a wonderful woman and one that understood the project and what was everything that ever happened on marriage. My wife kept a record of. It was amazing. She kept scrapbooks. She kept record. She kept dates, she kept phone calls, she kept a record of everything ever happened in our marriage in the 60 years. And I had those for a long time. And I go through them once around and just bring back the wonderful memories. But we built that. We built that through trust. And we built that through the fact that we always looked at any problem that popped up between us from the other person's perspective. And we avoided a lot of problems with that technique.
Charlie, I'm reminded when I talked to your brother Dick, who is, of course, the House Majority Leader, for those that don't know, during the big Republican Revolution, and we're going to have the two of you together, hopefully in the next week or two on the show. But the whole idea of the marriage and the family and working together in those challenges and how that's so critical, because if you're both stressed out, it takes away from what you're actually performing and delivering on the other end. So Charlie, before the break, we were talking about marriage and relationships, and women, and obviously NFL players are men, right? So you have many wives that end up staying home with their careers and stuff, but it seems to me as the NFL's growing, they want to grow the broader audience. And my wife's a big football fan. She always say, who's playing today? What games we want to watch? And we usually watch one game a Sunday, and we're all over the place on who we're watching. But it's interesting, a woman's perspective on watching a game is much different. She wants to know, is he married? Do they have kids? And just different than the guy's mindset. But it seems to me that I want to ask your perspective about women reporters. I think there's some very good ones, and I don't mean to take anything away from it, but it seems to me the NFL just patronizing a little bit the Americans so they watch it, so we can get women to watch it. Do you think that's happening, or am I just warped?
No, and originally that was the whole idea of getting women involved as reporters and sideline reporters. And actually, some of them are very good and excellent at what they do. But the whole idea in the beginning, when this started to happen years and years ago, was that they wanted to build more interest within the women, so they would be able to capture them on Sunday like they've already captured the men. When they talked about when turn off the screen, you made some mention about women, and when you go to ball games, different types of women at different types of ball games. I'll give you a little example about my influence. Whenever we drafted a player, I would have each one of the players come in and visit with me privately, one-on-one, just like father and son talking to them what they could expect, because they're going to be committed to a lot of money and things are going to happen. And I used to tell these players, and it was a very true statement, every young lady, when you go out, now you drafted the first pick in the draft, you're going to be worth millions of dollars. Whenever you go out and you start socializing and you met some young lady that shows some interest in you, remember her objective is she wants to get you into a relationship, because if she gets pregnant, and she wants to get pregnant and has a child, you're her meal ticket. And I cautioned them. I said, you got to be careful about your relationships, how you select them, and watch who you entertain with when you're not on the football field, when you're out in your social life. And a lot of that happened. And a lot of players paid attention to what you would tell them. And a lot of players just fall right into the trap. But one of the greatest players I ever had, Marshall Falk, I think he had 4 or 5 illegitimate children with 4 or 5 different women. And that he was supporting in both the women and all the children. And that wasn't a reflection. He fell into the trap that he thought this was a genuine relationship. And it's hard to define that. And so that's a perilous part of being a famous athlete, being a famous football, basketball player. You got a basketball player, basketball game is pretty evident in the basketball game, much more than it is in the football, because of the closeness inside the arena with basketballs. But I used to warn them, be careful. You have to be careful about your relationships and take it easy when you get into it. And a lot of players paid attention. And a lot of them went on to have great, successful marriages. But a lot of them fall into the trap that happens. And there's a name for it in political science, as you might know. There's a honeypot somewhere if you're successful, so beware.
Yeah, boy, you got that. I want to pivot a little bit, but stay on the same theme a little bit. Some of these players have tremendous faith testimonies. I think of Kurt Warner in the movie that was done on him, and you obviously helped find him. And there's the C.J. Stroud for Houston, Patrick Mahomes. There's just a bunch of just really Carson Wentz. These people, their Christian faith is so important to them. Talk to me a little bit about what you experienced and your view of that and how the part it played in those athletes' lives.
It's tremendous relief when you see a player that has accepted Jesus Christ and his religion because they're on the right track. They're going to want to live a righteous life and contribute to society. Kurt Warner is a classic example of a man who lives his faith. He does a lot of charity work, and help for disability type children and things like that that people aren't even aware of. And a lot of these guys that do these things because of their faith in their religion, they do it not for recognition. They do it because they want to make sure in their heart they're giving back for what they've achieved from the gift of their success. And they all believe, every one of them, 100%, believe their gift came from God and they need to share that gift with other people. So it's very genuine. Torrey Holt was a classic example. With Torrey Holt, we drafted the sixth player in the draft. We brought him into the draft room, signed him to contract, give him millions of dollars. I brought him in my office. We were sitting there talking. I said, what did you do now with all that money? His mother had died just before he was drafted. He was taking care of his younger brother and younger sister. He said, well, I paid off all my sister's loans for college and made sure I set up an account so she could continue to go to school, doesn't have to work herself to death. And I paid off all my brother's accounts and his college tuition and everything. I made sure that he's going to be able to finish his education. And again, his brother did achieve success and also played in the National Football League. And I said, Torrey, what did you do yourself? He said, I gave some money to my church because I believe that God is responsible for my success. And then I went out and bought myself a pair of blue jeans. And this guy made millions. And he took care of everybody but himself.
Wow.
That's a good example of what the faith means to the players that believe in it. And all the great, and a very strong thing that I've noticed in all the years I coached in college and in pro football. The black players really radiate not just to their fathers, but to their mothers and their grandmothers. And what their mothers and their grandmothers told them about religion, about how they should live, sticks with them very firmly. That's like throwing a piece of mud on the wall and it won't come off. They're really influenced by their mothers and their grandmothers, and a lot too by their fathers. But I noticed that as a great tradition in them and with the black players, and I admire that. I admire the fact that their parents, their grandparents took a great interest in their faith, in their religion, as they did in their football. And that's very rewarding when you see that and you see how a young man develops from that.
Pivoting a little bit related to that same comment is there was a lot of fatherless African-American black people that ended up in the NFL, and they have their mom or their grandmother that was their light for them. And I always worried about, I think a strong role model of a father plays such an important part in a family, along with the mother. And I've always wondered about the impact of that. And did you see that to be a high number typical?
Yeah, I trace that back in my mind. This is just in my mind. If you go back several years ago, before we started getting so involved in the social work and giving grants, and so people living off Social Security and stuff like that, there were very few black families that were separated. Most of them had very strong marriages and raised a lot of children. I think Bruce, for example, his mother and father, same mother, same father, they raised 17 children and all of them were successful. So I trace this back to when the social became a socially accepted for black and poor white people or white people to live separately and get government grants. I blame that on a lot of the division for the marriages. And I blame that on a lot of the problems with the black families having a fatherless home. And thank God that the wives, the mothers, and the grandmothers were so firm, and they just are remarkable people. What they've achieved in contributing to the success of their children, both men and women. But I blame a lot of that problem on the social activity and how it developed when you made it easy for the people to live apart and get government assistance. And I blame that a lot on what happened to these young people.
To me, it sounds like you got a lot of the same political leanings that your brother Dick does. And it's going to be interesting because I really look forward to having both of you on a show together and just growing up together. You talked about that you were held back in the fourth grade, and so you got to grow up together in the same grade, but you were a year older. And but Dick talks so fondly of you and his relationship, always joking and saying, "Yeah, everybody said, are you Charlie's younger brother?" and said, "War on him in time."
I get a kick out of that than what I hear just the opposite. Are you related to Dick Armey? Do you know him? So that just thrills me when that happens. I get such a great kick of whenever that happens to me.
I love the story that he talks about for Dick Gephardt, who was from Missouri, when you end up in St. Louis, and he reached out to Gephardt, who of course was a leader, a Democrat leader, and he had made the comment that now you guys are finally in St. Louis going to get a Super Bowl, and lo and behold, you delivered for them. So that's not an insignificant thing, is it?
He was always showed great confidence in me, as I have him. There was never any doubt in my mind that he would be successful in whatever he did, because I knew his mindset. When he set his mind to doing something, nothing deterred him. He was going to achieve that success, whatever it was. He was going to achieve that success, and then it's just remarkable how when we were both graduated from high school, the superintendent of school told me I had to join the service, and they told Dick, you had to stay with that job you have with RE Electric, because neither one of you guys are capable of achieving any success in college. He goes, I get a doctor's degree, and I go and get a master's degree in finance. And that's a remarkable story. You'll have to ask him about the story when he got his master's degree, what he said to the person who followed him on the stage. It was a great story.
I'm looking forward to that. We're going to dig down in a bunch of players, and I'm just going to rattle through them. And Charley, I want you to give me your perspective on some of them. I've talked before, I'm a Rams fan, so being able to talk to you, helping win that Super Bowl is a big deal because you're general manager. But back in the 80s, when I was just out of high school, those 49ers were cleaning up on my Rams all the time, and Joe Montana and Jerry Rice, Ronnie Lott. There were some great athletes. Talk to us a little bit about that team and some of the players.
I'll give you a story about Jerry Rice. When Jerry Rice played that small college in Mississippi, they sent me out to time him, to work him out and time him, because he was setting such phenomenal records at that small college. So I went out to that, timed him in grass. He ran a 4.65. I can remember exactly what he ran. So I went back with my report and worked out to Norm Pollum, who was the director of player personnel, and I said, this is what he ran, and I timed him twice to make sure I got it right. And he said, you got it wrong, go back and time him again. So I had to go all the way back to Mississippi, get Jerry Rice out and time him again, and he ran the same. And I said, that's what he runs. And I said, I don't know how he plays, but that's what he runs. And I'm going to remember now, young scout, Norm Pollum says, I'm not sure you got it done right, but anyway, in the draft, he was selected. And then he proved a point that I've always made to my scouts since that day. It's not how fast they run, it's how fast they play. And there's so many contributing factors to how fast they play. Jerry Rice, maybe wasn't one of the fastest players on the field, but he was the quickest into his break and out of his break and separated the quickest. He run flawless patterns on his patterns when he's coming off the football. It was very hard to jam because of his quickness. So it's not how fast you run, it's how fast you play. Torrey Holt was much the same way. Isaac Bruce, much the same way. There was a lot of guys that ran a lot faster, but most of them couldn't catch either one of them on the football field. So I learned a lesson very young with Jerry Rice. Don't worry about how fast they run, worry about how fast they play, because there's a lot of contributing factors that make the difference.
You have a story on Joe Montana, because he didn't throw these big, long bombs, but he still threw a lot of bombs at Jerry Rice, but he had these little darts. He could just go down the field so fast before it was like, if there was a minute left and they were behind and they had the ball and could win, it was like, I might as well just shut the TV off. It's over. Talk to us a little bit about Joe Montana from your perspective.
I think I told you the story about Cochran, who was a scout who coached for Vince Lombardi. He was on Vince Lombardi's staff, and we're in the draft. Joe Montana's year that he, in the first round, Cochran gets up on the table practically screaming, we got to draft Joe Montana. And the people look at him, what, are you crazy? He's barely 6 foot tall and he doesn't have a strong arm. Yeah, but he's accurate and he completes the passes we're not going to draft Joe Montana in the first round. Same thing happened in the second round, and he's up at the table. This time he's lying around with his arm. You got to draft Joe Montana, and they keep ignoring him. Finally, in the third round, I said, okay, Cochran, if Joe Montana's there, we'll take him. 49ers took him right in front of us, and the rest is history. But you should listen to a guy who's been there and done that. He saw something in Joe Montana that everybody else ignored, and that was his ability to get the ball off on time and getting the ball accurately off on time. And that's the traits. If you look at this quarterback today at Ohio State, watch his quarterback in the playoffs. He not only gets the ball off on time, but his accuracy is uncanny. Look at the quarterback at the Patriots. He gets the ball off time, and his accuracy is impeccable. He gets the ball where it has to be. Kurt Warner, I used to say, he always delivers the ball so the receiver can take it and advance it. In other words, he doesn't have to stop, slow down, reach back, reach up, and catch the ball. He catches it in stride because Kurt Warner delivered it where it has to be so he could continue on with the success of the play. There's a lot of things about a quarterback that people should ignore. First of all, ignore their athletic ability. It doesn't have anything to do with their success. Okay, it's nice to have a great athlete and all that, but Joe Montana was not a great athlete. Tom Brady was not a great athlete. Kurt Warner wasn't a great athlete. A lot of them go back that weren't great athletes that are great players at that position because of one thing. They process the information fast, they release the football fast, and they are accurate. And that's how I graded quarterbacks my whole career based off of that philosophy. And I had a great success grading quarterbacks, which I was pretty proud of. Whenever I graded a quarterback and felt how they paid attention because I had a good success with grading quarterbacks. But those are the guidelines I followed.
Talk to me about John Elway.
John Elway had everything. John Elway had everything. I go back to a long history with John Elway. His dad and I coached together at the University of Montana. And so I know John Elway from the day he was a young kid. He used to walk down the hill to meet the bus with my oldest daughter. But I videoed his first little high school, little league football game. I don't know. I think I must have lost you there or something.
Nope, we're good. We're good. We're still going.
Oh,
Good away.
I lost the picture someplace.
Okay, we're good. We got you.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so John Elway, I witnessed everything from him developing how he was such a great athlete and everything he did. And the one thing I always knew about him is his motivation and his drive. He was a great competitor. In everything he did, he was a great competitor. I don't know what keep going on. I keep losing. But anyway, here I'm back.
No, you're good. We haven't lost you, but you might have something going with your screen. That's the problem with doing video.
Okay. All right. Anyway,
we're good.
We're good. But anyway, so following John Elway's career, I knew he could have. John Elway was a great athlete on top of being everything you look for in a quarterback, but he was a great athlete. He could have played professional baseball. He had a contract with the New York Yankees, and when the Indianapolis Colts drafted him, they said, I'm not playing for the Indianapolis Colts. If you don't trade me or honor the trade I'm looking for, I will play baseball. And he already had $1 million deposit from the Yankees to play baseball. So they agreed to trade him to the Denver Broncos for an offensive tackle. And that was a great trade for the Denver Broncos. And for them, the offensive tackle would not become a Hall of Fame offensive tackle. But that's a great story on John Elway because he had everything. He's the only player I ever graded that I give the top grade to in football. And that's when I gave him an 8.0, and I never ever give another player that same grade in graded because he had everything and all the personality and everything. There was a lot of guys in that draft with him that had the same talent. One was drafted by the Miami Dolphins. He had the same talent and skill and everything as a John Elway, but he had a little bit of a character flaw, which I won't go into, that John Elway did not have. And that's what made me grade him much higher than the other player. And he went out in Miami, drafted him, I think, 16th in the draft. anyone would be one of the greatest players that ever played the game too. So,
You must be talking about Dan Marino.
of course, I like. Anyway, I could tell you the problems, yeah, but I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's good history. But you find those families, and you got to evaluate all those things. You got to be able to evaluate all the. I also absolutely rejected a great player that's in the Hall of Fame because I took him off our board because of his character flaws. And so one of his character flaws was that he had a lot of difficulties, was released from 2 different schools because of his difficulties, his sex-related issues. And so they asked me, well, why in the world would you take this guy off your draft board if he's such a great player? I said, because if I bring him in our community and he continues his pattern with this sex problem and somebody's family gets affected by it, I'm the guilty party. I took him off the draft board. He's a Hall of Fame player, and I took him off the draft board knowing exactly how great the player was, but now also knowing that the risk of him contributing something bad to our community was not worth the risk taking. But he went on, became clear in his life, became a great player. He's a Hall of Fame player today, and I'm very proud of the fact of what he achieved. Again, it can probably be traced back to his grandmother. If you knew the player, you probably could trace back to his grandmother, straighten him out. Just like Brett Favre. Everybody talks about Brett Favre's success. Brett Favre's success is traced to one person, his wife. I could give you the whole story. I was at Atlanta when we drafted him. He came to Atlanta. We couldn't find him. He had a drug problem. We couldn't find him. He'd be in hotels. When his wife got a hold of him when he was traded to Green Bay and traded him out, it's either you get straightened out or you're not going to have a media marriage anymore. She straightened him out, and he went on to be one of the greatest quarterbacks that ever played. But his success wasn't his ability. His success was the fact that his wife didn't desert her love for him and made it achieve success. And so there's some great stories. I could tell you a lot of great stories of a lot of other great players that happened, and some sad stories that happened as well. But Lawrence Phillips was an example of a sad story of a person that had all the talent in the world to be one of the greatest running backs to ever play in the NFL, but he couldn't overcome his personality defects. And of course, he later died in jail, and was what a waste. And he didn't have somebody to come along and save him. But he was at the Rams when we came there, when Dick Vermeil came there. And I'll never forget how hard Dick Vermeil did to revive him as a human being. Don't worry about it. Dick Vermeil never worried about him as a football player. He saw the trends that what was happening to this man in his personal life, was trying to revive him personally and get him back into the fold, and it just didn't work. There's an example of bad case.
So I want to ask you a little bit about a couple running backs of that 80 era, Earl Campbell and Walter Payton. Tell me about those 2 athletes, what you'd grade them.
Earl Campbell, the great Earl Campbell, I remember now. I remember very fondly when we went down to play Texas. I was at the University of Montana, and we had a great football team. With the exception of Texas, we went undefeated. But we went down to Earl Campbell was a sophomore. We're playing in the ball game. Let me tell you a little story leading up to that first. We're down in Texas. I'm coaching at the University of Montana, and I have my brother on the football field with me as a guest, and I get him dressed out like a coach, and I'm standing there working getting ready for the game to start. And I look down, and there's my brother down there with the head coach for the Texas football team getting his autograph. I said, what in the world? What in the world were you getting his autograph for? He says, I was getting it from my children. I said, we're getting ready to play. You're getting the head coach's autograph. That's crazy. But the game starts. The first player, they have the ball. The first play, they hand off to Earl Campbell, and he goes for a touchdown. They kick off to us, and we finally punted him. The next play, they hand off to Earl Campbell, he goes for a touchdown. This goes on and on. So finally, the score is 45-0. And now Darrell Royal's punting on 3rd down to keep it from being too embarrassing for us. And we had a good football team, but we just couldn't handle Earl Campbell, who was the best running back at that point I had ever seen in my life. because he was a brute. You couldn't tackle the guy. He has great vision, but you couldn't tackle him. And let me give you another story about Earl Campbell. He goes on and plays pro football, and Houston's getting ready to draft, and of course the head coach wants Earl Campbell. And then one of the scouts, and I'll never forget the stats up in, this is a true story. He says, Coach, I don't think we can draft Earl Campbell with the, and expect him to succeed. And Don Phillips says, why is that? He says, because he hasn't shown that he can catch the football. And Earl, and Don Phillips says, I got a solution for that. We'll just hand it to him twice. Well, that was a great story about Earl Campbell. So Earl Campbell was a great player and a great human being. Again, Earl Campbell was a very humble person and went on in success. And he's a person that the profession can be proud of because of the way he handled himself before, during, and after his playing time.
I think I read somewhere that his thighs were like 34 inches. They were like, he was a big guy.
You thought he was a truck coming down the road. You looked up there and just, oh my gosh, their eyes would be as big as saucers thinking, how am I going to tackle this guy? But no, he was a great player and a great human being. And one of the greatest players that ever played the game. And there's a lot of players. I can remember a lot of great players that played the game. And they're not always on offense either. You got to remember there's some great players that played the game. Bruce Smith was a defensive end for the Buffalo Bills. He was one of the greatest players I ever watched play. And one of the nice things about Bruce Smith, we had a guy named Bruce Armstrong on our team at the Patriots. And when they went against each other, Bruce Armstrong won every single battle. Finally, they just put Bruce Smith on the other side. Because all the years I watched Bruce Armstrong, I never saw him get beat on a one-on-one pass block. So there's some great players that aren't always just quarterbacks or running backs. Bruce Armstrong, Bruce Smith, two classic examples of two great players that played against each other and showcased their talent. But that happens in every era of football. You find great players that come forward and distinguish themselves. Tom Brady, of course, is the classic example everybody relates to today. 7 Super Bowl rings. It's pretty hard to top that.
How about Reggie White, Green Bay Packer?
Reggie White, when I was with the Memphis Showboats as a general manager, we signed Reggie White. He actually played for us at the Memphis Showboats, and then he went on to the Green Bay Packers. But again, I'm a very humble person, a great player, highly motivated, extreme athletic ability and quickness for a guy his size, proper and super attitude about everything. He had a great attitude, not only about football, but about life. He was a very successful, wonderful human being to be around and a great player. They don't make many guys totally like they made Reggie White. And it was a loss to our society and our football world when he passed away. But he was a great player. It'll come along very often like him. You can find one it's a treasure. It really is a treasure.
So one last player before I ask you who you think is the greatest player in football that you recall. Tell me about Walter Payton. He's got the Walter Payton Award. Brett Favre called him on the podcast. He thinks the best runner in football history.
I agree with Brett Favre on that. Just as a pure runner, there was nobody better. I tell you what, his ability to break tackles and his vision and his ability to make jump cuts, it was unreal. There was a lot of guys that you can compare him to, but nobody that can live up to what he did as a running back. And it was always, again, about his commitment. He has a commitment to being that type of a player. He used to strap weights on his back and run uphill when he was training for the next season that come about. He was very dedicated in how he trained. I knew him very well because his brother played for me at one point when I was coaching in the USFL, and I knew the family very well. And one time we're playing with the Chicago Blitz, and we're at the Chicago Stadium. Now, he made the Chicago Stadium famous for how he ran the football. So I'm standing outside of our dressing room, and his brother, of course, is inside the dressing room, was playing for us at that time. Along comes this guy, and he wants to know if it's okay if he goes in the dressing room. And I looked at him and said, what are you talking about? You own the dressing room. You go wherever you want. And that was him. And I'll never forget his greatness. Again, a lot of these guys that are great are humble. They recognize their ability, that's a God-given ability, and they're humble about it. He was a classic example, a classic human being, the way he lived on the field and the way he lived off the field. And I agree with Brett. He's probably the greatest pure runner that I ever saw. Now, on the other hand, one of the best runners and best receivers I ever saw was Marshall Faulk. He's one of the few guys that had 1,000 yards rushing and 1,000 yards receiving in the same season. I think there's 3 of them. And the kid at 49ers has achieved that success. But I think there's only 3 in the history of the game that have done that. But Marshall Faulk wasn't as great a runner as he was on the inside running game, but he contributed so much to the passing game. When he played for the Indianapolis Colts, they split him out as a wide receiver more than they run him as a tailback. And it was amazing how they wasted the type of talent. When Marshall Faulk came out of San Diego State, I wrote an article. Somebody got me on a big sporting deal, and I was running the draft for the Patriots, and they ran an article, and I just said, I don't know who's going to win the Heisman Trophy, but the greatest player in college football today is Marshall Faulk. There's nothing he can't do. And he's the greatest player. He should win the Heisman Trophy. I think he was 3rd or something. But Bill Parcells comes to me and says, now look at the hole you left me in. Marshall Faulk's there in the draft. When you don't draft him, everybody will think I'm crazy. And I said, no, coach, if he's there, we don't draft him, we're crazy. And I'm like for me, I always use the word we because we contribute everything to our success if they were together. But he was the best all-around, overall running back that I was ever around, Marshall Faulk. The best running back, of course, it's Payton. And he was phenomenal and a remarkable human being with a remarkable career and history that will never be forgotten.
Oh,
the
Charlie,
Award is maybe one of the most cherished rewards in football.
When I interviewed your brother, Dick, I based it on the book Leader that he wrote, his autobiography. And he said to me in the interview, or maybe between segments, that he's been trying to get you to write an autobiography. Since your wife has written all those notes, I think you better get started. You got a lot of good stories. We need to hear those. I don't have enough hours on my TV show to cover all of them.
There's a lot of great stories that I thought about writing. The only thing that keeps me from writing a book about my life and my history, my relationships, what I've achieved and what I haven't achieved, what we've achieved as a group and what we haven't achieved. The fact is, I might say something in the book that might offend somebody's family because I'm a very honest person. There's somebody out there I didn't like or I didn't think contributed to success, I would probably say so. But I would never do that for the fact that I wouldn't want to embarrass their children, their spouse, or anybody in their family. I've had a lot of opportunities to do interviews about situations that I didn't agree with and stuff. But I've held back on most of that because I do not want to offend anybody's family or especially their children. Their children cherish their mothers and their fathers, and I don't want to do anything to put any tarnish in it. The only reason I've written the book is because at some point, when you write a book, you got to be honest. You got to tell why you didn't like this guy, why you didn't like that guy. I'm not going to do that.
Charlie, I got 30 seconds left. We're all done. Who's the best NFL player in your mind that contributed to the game?
Wow, there are so many great players, but I would guess you'd have to say Brady at this point. How can you win 7 Super Bowls and not be considered the greatest guy that ever played the game? You go and you gauge everything by success. Pro football, you gauge it by winning. So if you're going to gauge the player who is the most successful, the greatest player, you got to go about what he's achieved. And I would have to say that's Tom Brady.
Charlie, thank you for joining us on The Horn. We're going to do one more segment. I just got to rope your brother in with you, and maybe we'll wrap up one more series with the Armey brothers. How's that?
That'll be great. I'll be looking forward to it.
All right, so we've been talking to Charley Armey on The Horn, scout, general manager for the Rams, distinguished career in NFL, and a great North Dakotan, grew up in Candu, North Dakota. And of course, another famous brother, his brother Dick Armey, who is majority leader for the Republicans. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. Thanks for watching.